Welcome to Mob Talk Sit Down and the Philly Prime Podcast. This week, Martin Taccetta, jailed Lucchese crime family capo, gets his day in court after almost 3 decades behind bars, and he's taking on the state prosecutor who put him in prison. He and his defense team, a 5.5-hour hearing. George, you've looked at this. Your thoughts going into this? Was his big day in court?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very convoluted case, and there are no direct answers to any of this, but it looks like the state has a problem here. I mean, from what I saw, that the first, about 5 or 6 hours of hearings, testimony, there's a real question about tampering with some evidence and not turning evidence over to the defense during the trial. And those are 2 grounds for the judge to take some action. I think that's what we're waiting for now.
Yeah, and for Taccetta, what do you think about this? I had a chance to talk to him, and I'll talk about that in the courtroom for a couple of minutes. But this is a big day for him. He's been behind bars 28 years.
Yeah, and clearly he's paid a price. 28 years is a long time behind bars. It's amazing. I mean, he's still fighting. He still thinks he's got a shot, and I think he does have a shot to get out. What he gets out to, what he goes back to, is a whole nother question. If you talk to law enforcement, he and his brother are dyed-in-the-wool Lucchese guys, and they're watching even now. But it's a case that has a lot of different tentacles, raises a lot of questions about the way the process works, and whether in this particular case the government either dropped the ball or tried to manipulate. We don't know.
Yeah. All right. We have some video of Martin Taccetta, the most recent video you'll see of him. I have to say, George, for a guy who's 73, 74 years old, he was in remarkable shape. I was a few feet away from him in the courtroom. You can see him right there sitting in the jury box before he went to the defense table. In a good mood, seems very upbeat about this, seems very hopeful that this will happen. Your thoughts seeing him after 28 years behind bars? Looks pretty good.
Well, I mean, some guys know how to do time, and other guys, the time does them. I think he's adapted, and he does look good. I mean, it's a guy who I think has always tried to stay focused on this issue. And after 28 years, it looks like it's come to fruition. It's a difficult life, but I think he's got family support. He's got a support from his wife and kids. He's got support from his brother. All of that helps. And it's been a long, long road for him.
Yeah. They were in court, sitting in the second row back. His wife, one of his sons, a couple of friends of his, those kind of things. They exchanged waves, kind of hellos, that kind of thing from up in the front of the courtroom. George, the big part of this hearing was the face-off between the defense team and former Deputy Attorney General Robert Carrol, who prosecuted this case and whose name has come up repeatedly now in motions by the defense concerning evidence, whether it was turned over, whether it was not. Questions about whether evidence was altered, not blaming him, but just saying he's the prosecutor in the case. So long last, Robert Carrol took the witness stand. Now, I worked with Bobby Carrol in the AG's office when he was with the Organized Crime Strike Force. That's him right there up on the witness stand. They got their day in court with him, George, and he did a pretty good job holding his ground here, but still left some areas a little bit gray. What's your thoughts from his testimony that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, I think he took the position that, we clearly didn't do anything wrong, and I did what I was supposed to do. One of the big issues is, did he turn over these dental records to the defense, and did he turn over the FBI analysis of those dental records to the defense during the trial, prior to the trial? He says he turned the information over to Martin Taccetta's attorney. One of the arguments is he should have turned it over to all the attorneys in the case. And this revolves around Martin Taccetta's at the dentist on the day that James Craparata is beaten to death. That was his supposed alibi. And here's dental records that show that. And there's a lot of twists and turns in all of this, Dave, as you well know. I mean, one of the arguments, and I think Carrol alluded to this, was even with those records, he still could have been at the dentist and gotten to the murder scene in time to take part in the murder. So we don't think that alibi would have carried any weight.
Yeah.
The problem was there were so many questions raised about, it was June the 12th, right? 6/12 was the date.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And somebody had changed that 6 to an 8. and tampered with the evidence? And that's a fundamental question. And so that's part of it as well. The irony is Martin Taccetta was tried and convicted of racketeering, was not convicted of the murder.
Right.
Murder played a big part in the overall racketeering case. And the second irony from my perspective is, and we don't have an answer to this, is his lawyer never tried to use the alibi defense, even though it was out there. So as I said, there's many, many unanswered questions here, but I think it's going to revolve around the way the government handled this evidence and the lack of transparency, or the lack of turning it over to all the defense rather than just Martin Taccetta's attorney.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about that evidence. The dental records show that he was at the dentist office, which is an hour away. Listen, he might have made it to Toms River in time to do this murder if you want to give it that shot, but I doubt anybody was driving 80 miles an hour down the Garden State Parkway to get to Toms River to do this. That I don't think holds a lot of water. He said it, and as Bob Carrol likes to say, if I said it once, then I said it. But having said all that, he had some serious questions because he originally got copies of the dental records, which showed the 6/12 date, which is the date of the murder and the date that he was at the dentist office, he says, having his teeth worked on. Those were copies. Bobby Carrol had asked the defense, since it raised the possibility that there might be an alibi defense, for the originals. 2 months later, he finally gets the originals, like 4 days before they're going to go to court in the trial, or maybe a few more days than that. So he looks at the original copy, and he sees markings on the original copy, and he said it looked like some of it was contrived, like it had been messed with. So he writes a letter to the FBI asking them to take a look at it, specifically the date and a couple of other things. They send it off to the FBI.
But at this point,
go ahead.
But the original still lists 6/12 as the date.
Yes.
The original still lists 6/12 as the date, right? All right, go ahead.
Right. But then there's some markings on it that make it look like someone tried to tamper with the date. And the FBI has a process where they can raise multiple levels from a document to see what was on the original document, any layers that were above it in writing or erasures, things like that. So they looked at it. They came back with a report saying the originals had been tampered with. I don't know why the defense would tamper with the 6/12 date, since that's what he was claiming all along. It really wouldn't do them any benefit. But anyway, that report comes back, and as you just stated, Bobby Carrol was questioned extensively on both direct examination and cross-examination by Taccetta's attorney, Marco LaRocca, about those records, the originals, and the FBI report, and was it sent to all of the defense attorneys. He claims he gave it to Mr. Runke, who was Taccetta's attorney. The cross-examination was, why didn't you give it to all the defense attorneys? Because the murder is intertwined with all the charges, and they should have had an opportunity, all of the defense attorneys, to look that over, challenge the records if it did come in as an alibi defense, and use some of that to discredit witnesses who were up there. That never happened. Bobby Carrol stuck to his testimony in court and said he handed them over to Taccetta's attorney. That's going to come up in another hearing coming up, whether that actually happened. But I have to say this, Bob Carrol stuck to his guns here, George, and you heard him at one point, Marco LaRocca and the Deputy Attorney General Dan Bornstein questioned him about would anybody or could anybody or did anybody tamper with these records? And George, tell him what Bobby Carrol said.
No, absolutely not. I mean, again and again, he and one of the investigators both denied anybody fooled with the records. However, somebody did change the 6 to an 8. At some point in this convoluted story, somebody changed 6/12 to 8/12. And I thought it was Maria Noto with another defense attorney?
Yes.
I mean, at one point, and I wrote this down, somebody with a motive to change the records changed them. That's misconduct. I mean, and nobody is acknowledging or nobody's accusing anybody doing it, but clearly the date was changed on one of those documents sometime between the time it was sent to the FBI and sent back. And again, it raises more questions than it answers, but I think it gives a basis for what we're talking about here, which is an appeal asking for a new trial, government failure to disclose, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
we'll see. I think we got one more hearing, and then the judge is going to rule on this.
Yeah, and this hearing after 5.5 hours still left that gray area you're talking about right there.
Right.
Who did it? Why weren't they turned over? Were they not turned over? Were they turned over? That kind of thing. Maria Noto said they were not turned over to her. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to talk about one of the face-off kind of issues here between Marco LaRocca for Mr. Taccetta and Bob Carrol when he was on the stand was over whether it mattered at all, because Mr. Taccetta was found not guilty of the Craparata murder. Michael Ryan was found not guilty of it. And the defense's contention is that this would have affected everything, that a lie in one is a lie in all. And they kept going at Mr. Carrol about this all being intertwined, that if this happened, this affected everything in the case. And in fact, Marco LaRocca tried to make the argument by making Mr. Carrol read back his closing statement. And George, in there, he said in his closing statement, murder, money, and extortion. That's what this case is about, in their own words and their own actions. He linked them all together, and Marco LaRocca pounced on that. Carrol would not agree with the intertwined word, but when you say in your closing statement, murder, money, extortion, that's what this case is all about, that kind of links them all together, and I kind of felt like the judge was at least buying into that argument by LaRocca.
No, that's a fundamental defense position. And the other thing that shouldn't get lost is what Maria Noto and others have said is two of the key witnesses in this case, two cooperators, Alphonse Diarco and Phil Leonetti, both testified that Taccetta bragged about taking part in the murder. Yet here is documented evidence, dental records that indicate he couldn't have taken part. So what they're saying is
yes,
that piece of evidence could have been used to discredit all the testimony from those two cooperating witnesses. And that's why it's of value. Whether or not Martin Taccetta was convicted of the murder is secondary to the point of we could have attacked the credibility of the government's two witnesses by showing, on the one hand, they're saying Taccetta did the murder. On the other hand, here's a document, by the way, that the FBI has validated.
Yes.
Another point that LaRocca made, which says Taccetta was at the dentist, so he couldn't have committed the murder. That's the kernel around which everything spins here.
Yeah.
And even though Martin Taccetta was not convicted of the murder, he was convicted of racketeering, sentenced to 30 years. The racketeering was a conspiracy, extortion, and the murder was a part of that extortion.
And as I said a few minutes ago, this leaves all of these areas still gray, which is why I think the judge is going to say, the defense doesn't have to prove who altered the records or who doctored them or anything like that. They're just trying to prove that they didn't get them.
Yes.
And they didn't get an opportunity then to use that evidence in exactly the fashion you just talked about against Mr. Diarco and against Mr. Leonetti. And listen, they read back some of the 302s from Al Diarco, who, by the way, at the time was the acting boss, I believe, of the Lucchese crime family, who then later flipped and was a government witness after a murderous spree in the Lucchese crime family that was the subject of a huge documentary in New York. Diarco recounted what Tommy Ricciardi said about it when he was cooperating and what Diarco himself says he heard from both Ricciardi and from Taccetta. And it was about the fashion of the murder and what happened in the murder. And he was trying to claim those guys were involved in the murder. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this, as you just mentioned, all plays out at a time when I remember I was there when Diarco testified.
Yeah.
When he was talking about the bosses in New York were very disenchanted with this New Jersey faction.
Yeah.
The Tacettas, Tumac, Asatura. They wanted to whack all of them. And at one point, Diarco's telling the story, and he says, it's a saga. And I mean, that's what it was. It was this internecine power struggle within the Lucchese organization. At the same time, this trial is going on. And then you can't even talk about this without making reference to the earlier federal case where all of these guys beat the feds in a big racketeering case. So all of that in terms of something being intertwined, all of that's intertwined in the judicial process here. And that's something else the defense has tried to harp on. This was a vendetta prosecution. That's what they're saying.
That was a year-long federal trial, correct, George? You covered some of it, I believe.
Almost 2 years, 20 months. 20 some defendants. All of these defendants in this case and about 15 others. And the jury's only out 2 days and they come back not guilty across the board.
Yeah.
Big loss for the feds.
And that was at a time when the Lucchese's were killing somebody every week, right?
Yeah. Well, you had gas pipe Casso up in New York, and you had Vic Amuso and those guys. I mean, it's, and from our perspective down here in Philadelphia, you also had the overlap where the Lucchese's basically stepped in and saved Nicky Scarfo Jr.'s life. I was going to say saved his ass, saved his life in that power struggle down in Philadelphia. So there's a lot of overlap there with that stuff. This particular case, the extortion they're talking about to control the boardwalk and was it Point Pleasant? Yep. There was both Philadelphia and Lucchese, New Jersey Lucchese got interested in that. So you got a lot going on here. And a lot of it is ancient history, but Martin Taccetta has spent almost 30 years in jail because of it.
Yeah. And there was actually a sit down, was there not, between the Philadelphia folks and the Lucchese crime family about who was going to get the Joker poker machines, who was going to get this, who was going to get that. And the Lucchese's won out, and the Crapparata murder is them attempting to take over or get a piece of a Joker poker operation down there. And when that didn't happen, the murder took place to send a message.
Well, supposedly Crapparata's two nephews ran the business, the vending machine business that had Joker pokers. And this was an attempt to show them, you got to pay us. On the other hand, the government and there are other government witnesses have argued they were always intended to pay. There was no need for this. So, this is in many ways, DiArco's right. This is a saga. And it's, from my perspective, people talk about the Sopranos and say that's the Cavalcanti crime family. I think the basis for the Sopranos was this New Jersey faction of the Lucchese's, the Acetora, the Taccettas, all of those guys. I mean, if you look at the stuff they were involved in, this is just one example. It's a story arc that could go on for several seasons. Absolutely.
Yeah. George, you and I have talked about this soundbite for a long time, many times. Bob Carrol reading from the 302s in one of the more chilling moments during this 5.5 hour long hearing talks about Al DiArco's conversations with Ricciardi, and he says with Taccetta about the murder in which a golf club was used to beat Jimmy Sinatra, Vincent Crapparata, that was his nickname, to death. And there was some debate about using baseball bats or golf clubs. Take us through that soundbite, which will live on in infamy. It's a chilling soundbite.
Right, they're talking about. I mean, this was a brutal murder where he was beaten to death with golf clubs. And at one point, when somebody's recounting it to DiArco, and they said, "Well, we didn't use baseball bats because baseball bats break, golf clubs don't break." I mean, it was chilling. I mean, it was brutal. I mean, all of this aside, Jimmy Crapparata, Vincent Crapparata, was brutally beaten to death, and whether the Taccetta was involved, not involved, that was a brutal organized crime hit. And it underscores that, we can make light of some of this stuff and we can joke about these guys that are real life Sopranos, et cetera, et cetera. That was a brutal murder. And we shouldn't lose sight of any of that. Whether the government played by the rules to win the conviction is a whole nother issue. Yeah. And the government's supposed to play by the rules. That's
right, let's be very clear here. Mr. Taccetta, Martin Taccetta, and Michael Ryan were acquitted of that murder.
Yeah, right.
Whatever Al DiArco might have been saying, that's fine. The Lucchese's were actually trying to break away. The Jersey Lucchese faction was trying to break away from New York at the time because of Amuso and Gas Pipe and the murder sprees that were going on in New York. And they actually came over and said they want to murder a whole bunch of guys in New Jersey. And the Lucchese crime family hierarchy here in Jersey was not really digging that, not happy with that, and concerned about how much heat this was going to bring. And it's interesting. DiArco says both Ricciardi and Taccetta said this is bringing a lot of heat on everybody, and that's why they were concerned about the situation.
Yeah, I mean, we know, we've seen that everywhere. Murders always attract multiple law enforcement agencies, and that is if you're running a business, and at the end of the day, one guy once told me, vice is commerce, it's business. You don't want that kind of heat. You don't want that kind of attention.
Right. And that's why they're not doing murders now, right, George? There haven't been murders in like 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think some guys have learned that lesson. And what's the point? What do you gain by all of that?
Yeah.
All you gain is attention.
Yeah.
unless unless you're using a murder to make a point. And then, the prosecution will argue this murder was to make a point to the Storino brothers, the nephews. You got to pay us. If you don't pay us, here's what happens.
Yeah, and to send a message to people who they were later going to shake down to get business interest on the Point Pleasant Boardwalk, which was the ultimate goal, it sounds like, about the motivation here, not just the Joker Pokers owned by the Storinos, but to get into that whole thing, which is a whole interesting thing into itself. The Philly mob tried to get into the boardwalk in Atlantic City. They were interested in getting on the boardwalk in Point Pleasant. Up and down the Jersey Shore, the mob was trying to put their hand on it.
Yeah, money to be made. It's always about the money. And that's what this is.
All right. George, one of the other interesting witnesses, and I know I'm sure you got a chuckle from her testifying, was Maria Noto, who is quite a defense attorney. I believe was in the original case, the federal case that they beat. She was quite colorful after they won that case. I saw her in a couple of live broadcasts out of New York talking about that case. But she was a very good witness here, I thought, for the defense. Your thoughts and about what she said here?
Yeah, I think she cut right to the heart of it. There was a lot of talk about did you turn it over or not with them. The bottom line, she said, was somebody tampered with this evidence. And we, the defense, don't have a motive. Why would we want to tamper with the evidence? This was his alibi. Somebody changed it. And that raises serious questions about the entire prosecution, whether who was aware of what when it happened. Those kind of things are fundamental to a fair trial. Yeah. And if the judge is listening, I think that's going to carry some weight at the end of the day. And, we've talked about where does it go now, Dave? What does the judge do? What's her options?
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to that in a second. Interesting. Maria Noto made a few points there, and she said, I want to be very clear. She repeated it multiple times during her testimony. I did not see the dental records. I did not see the FBI report, and I should have seen it.
Yeah.
And she talked about the rules of law. And George, she sits on a Supreme Court committee that deals with the rules of law. Take us to that little bit of testimony right there.
Yeah, that's what she was saying. We all should have gotten this because we're all part of the defense. And again, and then she raised the issue. This goes to the credibility of the government's two main witnesses. And any one of us defense attorneys could have used that to impugn all their testimony. As you said earlier, false and weren't false and all. And that wasn't given. They didn't have that opportunity because nobody gave them those records. Yeah. That's a fundamental question here. Yeah. She was very good at that. I think Carrol testified for about 2.5 hours. I think she testified for about an hour, but she lasered right in on what it was about. Yeah. And it came across very well, I thought.
I felt she slammed the door on that issue, to be honest with you, for the defense. Now we're going to hear from Michael Critchley and from Mr. Runke at a later hearing, possibly at the end of this month, which might tie up some of the other loose ends right here. But let me ask you, while I have you here, I thought Marco LaRocca, who was representing Mr. Taccetta, Stephen Duke was also at the defense table. He is the Ivy League law professor who helped get all this appeal started. Another gentleman was there who filed a Freedom of Information Act attorney for Mr. Taccetta, who's represented him for years, filed the Freedom of Information Act with the state and came up with the actual records, the FBI report, and this whole file that is in question was all his work. There's a pretty good defense team assembled right there. And Marco LaRocca's partner at his law firm also got up and did some questioning and did a great job with that. He has a good group, not the dream team like O.J. Simpson had, but this is a Jersey kind of dream team assembled right there, to go to bat for him.
Yeah, it's the way the system is supposed to work, and you like to see that. These are dedicated defense attorneys who see injustice. Basically what they're arguing is justice was not done here. And that's what this is supposed to all be about. You can wrap yourself in a flag and sound like a Yahoo, but that's really what this is supposed to be about. It's a trial is the search for truth, not for winning, but the search for the truth. And they're basically saying that in the search for the truth in this case, somebody played fast and loose with the rules. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. I think that came across very clearly. And, what happens now? We're going to hear from Mr. Runke. What I would like to hear from Mr. Runke is, why did you not why did you opt not to use the alibi defense at trial? And if he says, well, because I didn't have the right documents, that goes to the heart of what we're talking about here. I don't know what it's going to say, but I mean that. Yeah. And I think both he and Critchley have already signed affidavits saying they never got those documents.
Exactly. That's the point. And Maria Noto, by the way, did the same thing and then testified to it. If they're half as good as she was, I think that issue is settled right there. And then the other issue here with the judge, and we talked about what she might do, is whether this is all material to the rest of the case. Racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, the other charges that they were convicted of. The defense argues, as we talked about, false in one, false in all, that they should have had this so they could have impugned the government witnesses here. They could have attacked evidence. They could have said to the jury, hey, look what they did to us. They didn't give us evidence. They altered evidence. The evidence was altered. They had an FBI report we should have had. They could cast all kinds of doubt with that kind of thing. And you know, as well as anybody, it's all about, reasonable doubt. No. And if you can raise reasonable doubt, you can win the case.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's at the heart of it is she can say, any defense attorney can say, to the extent that DiArco and Leonetti testified about the extortion and the other bad acts that were part of this case, we could have challenged all of that if we'd have been able to say, you're lying about Taccetta and being there. How do we know you're not lying about other stuff? They didn't have the opportunity to do that because they didn't have the document.
Yeah. And there's also some concerns about whether 302s were turned over, things like that. But let me go back, if I can, for 1 second here. Before Bob Carrol left that witness stand, he made it very clear to both on direct by the state deputy attorney general and by Marco LaRocca that no one tampered with evidence, no one altered evidence, no one on my team. He called it a high integrity, veteran, experienced prosecution team, hardworking, that would never do that. And let me say this, Paul Smith, who is a detective state investigator for the Division of Criminal Justice back at the time in the organized crime group that Bob Carrol was in, along with some other very, very well-known people, got up on the witness stand, George, and he gave some testimony and kind of slammed that door closed himself on direct and then again on cross, denying that anybody touched this or tampered with it.
Yeah, clearly you would expect that's what they have to say. And I think Noto cut right to the heart of it is, again, somebody with a motive to change the records, change them. I mean, clearly somebody changed the 6 to an 8.
Or tried to, at least.
Yeah, and she said the defense would have no reason to do that. No. So who does that leave? That leaves somebody in the prosecution's team. That's the kind of the thing that overshadows all of this. And again, it may not even be germane. The judge can just decide, regardless, they should have been turned over. They should have had the opportunity. They should have seen those documents.
Yeah.
And now I think we'll see. I mean, I would think the judge is going to rule fairly quickly now. I mean, what else do you have to hear? You're going to hear from Rucky and Critchley. What else do you need? Let's make a decision. And then
summations and then a decision.
Yeah.
Know? And let's talk about the options here, George. What do you think the options are here?
Well, one, she could let the conviction stand, which given everything that's happened, I would find that hard to believe. The other thing is she could, I guess, throw out the conviction. Or the third thing is she can order a new trial based on the appeal that's filed. Now, the interesting thing with a new trial is, what does the government do then? Because DiArco is no longer among the
with
living.
Us.
Leonetti, from everything I'm told, has no desire, no way he's coming back to testify. Assator and Riccardi, 2 defendants in that case, became cooperators, and they've told different versions of the story. There's documents that go a lot of different ways. Where's the state going to go? How are they going to put on a new trial? Yeah. So I think at that point, some hard decisions have to be made. I mean, you and I have talked about this. The fair thing is to say, fold the tent. The guy did 28 years. Enough's enough. End of story. We'll see if they do that.
And let's
sometimes,
say this,
pride gets in the way. Sometimes
no doubt about that. No doubt about that. And listen, 28 years is pretty good. I mean, there were a lot of pride issues in Philadelphia on mob trials and things like that. The defense claimed racketeering light when Joey Merlino and those guys didn't get convicted of any of the violence in their 2001 trial, but they all, some of them got 14 years in jail. It depends on how you look at it. The glass is half full, it's half empty kind of thing. But in this case, I think that's a distinct, possibility here. Does she, even if she called for a new trial, George, in some of the documents, they list all the investigators who worked on this case 30 years ago. Half of them are deceased. So they couldn't be called back to talk about this very issue. Detective Gabriel Perez got up there. He's been involved with the current deputy attorney.
As you mentioned earlier.
Go ahead.
These are all good guys, too. I mean, we knew a lot of these guys.
Yes.
Mike Baza, Bobby Buccino. They're all good guys, all good guys. But they're no longer with us. So where are we? We'll see. I mean, I think the judge has got a lot to sift through, but I think she's already started the process of sifting through it.
Yeah. And I will talk about that in a second. I just want to mention another detective testified, Gabriel Perez. He's a state investigator working on an internal investigation that the Attorney General's office opened after these allegations were made to see if anybody tampered with the records. So far, they haven't come up with a conclusion other than to put on the evidence that they've been putting on. And Detective Perez was ice skating a little bit on his testimony there. He did a great job documenting what he did, but then he got a little bit tripped up by Marco LaRocca when they were talking about why certain documents they found weren't in the box with the case file on the alibi and the FBI report, why some documents were in another box and why they weren't in that box and things like that. And how did you find them? Did you find this? And he said, no, I didn't find that. There was a log they were looking for that he said he didn't find. 51 boxes of evidence kept for 30 years, George, in a warehouse in Ewing, New Jersey. Yep. He said he spent almost 2 solid days going through those boxes. I mean, that's what you got to do if you're going to put this case back on. That alone tells me they ain't going to do that.
Yeah, what a headache that is. I mean, I know just from researching archives, sometimes stuff is just thrown in a box and then it gets mixed up. And that could have been what happened here. Talk about cold cases. I mean, 30 years ago, I would be very surprised if the judge rules in Taccetta's favor. I'd be very surprised if we see another trial. I think it's over. Yeah. If she rules in any way in the defense's favor, I think that's the end of this case.
All right. And George, we talked about this before, and you mentioned that we spoke about it. Justice reform. We hear a lot about that in the last 5 to 10 years about sentences that were either unjust or too heavy for certain crimes. George Martirano in Philadelphia got life on a drug case, and Barack Obama gave him a pardon before he left office, and George Martirano got out of prison. Martin Taccetta has done 28 years. Yeah, Martin Taccetta has done 28 years here on a conviction for racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and a couple of other crimes in which there was no violence. He got acquitted on the violence. Is 28 years on a racketeering case enough, especially in this era, 2024, when everybody's talking about justice reform?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they would argue, I think he was convicted of being a leader of organized crime.
Yes.
That carries additional weight. But look at all the factors and everything here. 28 seems like an awful lot of time. I mean, we've seen guys get 10 to 15 in this kind of situation. He'd have been out 10 years ago if that was the case.
Yeah. Okay. George, sum this up for me. We've been talking about this for over a year now. Some of our other friends in the media are not talking about it. I think they should be. This is a, interesting landmark kind of, case here at some point, depending upon what the decision is. But I think Mr. Taccetta deserves his day in court. He got it. I did speak to him briefly. He seemed very upbeat about this. We didn't get into any details or anything like that. We said hello. And he did seem upbeat about the situation here. And as I said before, he's got a very good defensive team assembled right there to do this for him. It'll be interesting to see what kind of headline this gets when the case is decided.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is it's such an old case that you and I will remember because we covered it when it happened. But there are people working in the media now who might not even been born when this happened. So
there you go.
They don't have the perspective, and that coupled with the fact that organized crime, the mafia, Cosa Nostra, is not the the story generating institution that it used to be when we were writing about it. So all of those things factor in. But at some point, I think the media's got to pay attention, especially if Martin Taccetta either is released or wins the right to a new trial after spending 28 years in jail.
Yeah. And certainly if there was another trial here, this would attract quite a bit of attention down at Tom's River again, if they could even do that. I doubt that they could.
Yeah. I don't see that happening at all. I don't see how it can happen. But
okay. Let's call that the final word for today, George. Thank you for going through all this. It is a little bit convoluted. It is sometimes difficult to follow. I hope we did a good job trying to simplify it down for folks so you can understand it. It is kind of all over the place. There are a lot of issues here. And George, I need a guy like you to help explain that and unbox the boxes here, so to speak, and take the material out and discuss it. And I appreciate your time.
No, always a pleasure. Anytime, man.
All right, George, thank you very much. That's it for Mob Talk Sit Down and the Philly Prime podcast for this week. The hearing should be before the end of May. We'll bring you an update when that happens, and we'll see what the decision is. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you next time.